The mountains remember those who prepare, and they punish those who don't. This is a truth as old as the ridgelines themselves, carved into the limestone and clay by centuries of survivors and failures, by families who learned to read the seasons and those who refused to listen. In 1883, in the highlands of eastern Appalachia, where three valleys converged beneath a canopy of ancient oaks and hemlocks, where the creeks ran cold and clear from springs nobody had yet poisoned, a woman knew this truth the way she knew her own breathing. She lived by it. She had built her entire life around it. Her name was Agnes Whitmore, and she had been alone for 8 years, since the day her husband Thomas lay down with a fever and didn't rise again. The settlement that clung to the hillsides around her hollow, maybe 200 souls scattered across a dozen homesteads, thought of her as harmless at best, slightly mad at worst. They saw an old woman, weathered thin by time and work, moving through the autumn mornings in her faded wheat-colored wool dress, her white bonnet tied under her chin with cotton twine, her canvas apron perpetually stained with creek mud and the black soot of her outdoor fires. They saw a woman with a knife at her belt, cracked leather boots, hands that looked like tree roots, swollen at the knuckles from years of gripping tools and wringing water from raw linen. They saw someone who rarely spoke, who kept to herself, who seemed to be gathering things with the desperate intensity of an animal preparing for something nobody else could see. What they didn't know, what nobody knew except Agnes herself, and, latterly, a wild-eyed girl named Willa, who had come to her asking to learn, was what lay beyond the limestone outcrop at the far edge of her property, past the stand of hemlock and birch, down into the earth where the mountain held secrets it had kept for 10,000 years. 15 years ago, when Thomas was still alive and his hands were still steady on tools and his mind was still clear, Agnes had found the cave system while following a doe that had been raiding their vegetable garden. She'd tracked it down the slope, past a deadfall of ancient trees, until the ground simply opened up, a natural formation of stone, a mouth in the mountain that breathed cool air even in July. Thomas had explored it with her that first day, bringing candles, moving carefully over the loose shale. They had discovered that the cave wasn't merely a single chamber. It opened into passages, branching and rising, with at least 6 distinct connected rooms, some small and tight, others vast enough to lose yourself in, their ceilings disappearing into darkness that a candle flame couldn't reach. There was a natural spring, clear, cold, impossible to trace to its source, that rose in one of the middle chambers and trickled out through cracks in the stone, eventually forming a creek that fed one of the valley's waterways. The air circulation was perfect. Even in the deepest chambers, the temperature held steady between 45 and 58 degrees, never deviating, as if the mountain itself was a living thing maintaining its own internal balance. Thomas had suggested using it as a root cellar, and in that suggestion lay the seed of everything that would follow. But Thomas died, and after his funeral, after the mourning period, after the community had stopped bringing covered dishes and checking on her as if she were a child, Agnes had begun her real work. She had walked back into that cave system with her knife, her determination, and a vision nobody else could have understood. Over 15 years. 15 years of alone work. 15 years of stolen time from her garden, her chickens, her small corn patch. She had transformed those natural chambers into something closer to a fortress of provision. She had found the strongest, flattest stones and, using Thomas's tools and her own savage patience, had built shelves. Dozens of shelves. They rose from the floor of the main chamber in orderly rows, and on them sat jars, glass jars, hundreds of them, hundreds upon hundreds. Green glass, clear glass, amber glass where the light had changed them over years. Inside, beans she'd shelled and dried, preserved in perfect glass, sealed with beeswax and cloth. Corn cut from the cob, silver white and waiting. Tomatoes she'd stewed and sealed, layer upon layer, filling the jar to the neck, the liquid ruby dark and thick. Peaches from the wild trees that grew in the north slope of the valley, sliced thin and packed in syrup she'd made from honey, traded from the beekeeper 2 miles downslope. Pickled cucumbers, cabbage, beets, greens she'd gathered from the mountainside and preserved in a brine of salt and vinegar. Mushrooms, dozens of varieties she'd learned to identify with absolute certainty, dried and stored in bundles wrapped with twine, hanging from hooks she'd driven into the limestone, dangling above the shelves like delicate brown flowers made of nothing but memory and flavor. The fruit section held peach butter, apple butter, wild plum preserve. She'd made it all herself, boiling the fruit in a massive cast iron pot over an open fire outside the cave mouth, reducing it down to a thick, dark spread that would last for years without spoiling, sealed under a layer of mutton tallow. One entire chamber had become her smokehouse. She'd killed a deer in late autumn every year for 15 years. She was a better shot than most of the men in the settlement, and she'd smoked the meat over hickory fires, hanging it from ceiling hooks, letting the smoke cure it until it was mahogany dark and would last half a year, at least, without going bad. Hams from the wild boar she'd occasionally trapped, venison in long strips, sausage she'd made from a pig she'd raised and butchered herself, using every part, wasting nothing. The smokehouse chamber was a cathedral of meat, the air thick with the smell of smoke and salt and the kind of preservation that made your mouth water. In another chamber, in corner alcoves, she'd carefully selected for their dryness. She stored grain. Corn she'd dried cob whole in the months after harvest. Stored in sealed wooden barrels she'd built herself using techniques she'd watched her father use when she was a girl. Wheat berries, rye, some of it ground into flour, stored in cloth sacks that hung from above, away from any moisture. Beans in more jars, lentils, dried peas. Enough to make bread, enough to make porridge, enough to keep a person's belly from crying out in the middle of the night. And in crocks, dozens of crocks made of fired clay she'd gotten from a potter in the next valley over. She'd rendered lard. Pure rendered lard, white or pale yellow, sealed under cloth and stored in the cool darkness. It was cooking fuel. It was preservation medium. It was calories when nothing else would warm your chest from the inside. She'd filled 17 crocks during her 15 years of work. Each one held perhaps 5 or 6 pounds of rendered lard. She'd also rendered fat from the wild ducks that came to the creek in spring, from raccoons she'd trapped for their hides, from deer and boar. In the corner of the storage chamber, stacked carefully so they wouldn't crack, were dozens of jars of pure rendered animal fat. Precious weight, precious calories. The kind of thing that meant the difference between surviving starvation and becoming another ghost story. An entire wall of one chamber held her herbs, hanging from leather strips she'd created by smoking hide and stringing it through drilled limestone. Sage, thyme, yarrow, mint. Basil dried and fragrant. Medicinal plants, feverfew for headaches, meadowsweet for aching joints, comfrey for wounds, plantain for cough. Dried mushrooms again, but these were the medicinal kinds, the ones she'd learned about from an old Cherokee woman who'd lived in the mountains for 80-odd years before passing. Everything was labeled with her careful script on small pieces of birch bark, pressed into the bundles with twine. She'd even created an inventory system, small marks on a slate board tallying what she had, what she'd used, what needed replenishing. The mathematical precision of it would have astonished anyone who'd taken the time to look. She'd organized her knowledge into a system that could survive her own death, that could be understood by someone who came after her. She'd documented which plants dried best in which seasons, which preservation methods worked for which vegetables, how long each item could reasonably be stored before quality began to deteriorate. She'd learned through trial and error, through failures and successes, exactly how much salt was needed to preserve a ham, exactly when mushrooms were at their prime for drying, how to pack vegetables in jars without them crushing under their own weight or the pressure of the liquid that surrounded them. The cave system held not just food, but the accumulated knowledge of 15 years of meticulous work, every technique tested and refined until it was as close to perfect as human labor could make it. She'd built herself a sleeping platform in one of the smaller side chambers, using flat stones as a base and packing dry grass beneath blankets. She'd woven herself from sheep's wool she'd carded by hand during winter nights. The blankets were gray and dense, warmer than anything you could buy in the settlement's trading post. She had 6 of them, carefully stored in a wooden chest she'd built to protect them from damp. She'd built a fireplace, an actual fireplace, with a chimney that rose and split through a natural fissure in the roof of the cave, carrying smoke up and out where nobody could see it. The floor around the fireplace was carefully laid stone. The walls were scorched black from 15 years of fires. But the system worked perfectly. It drew air and heat and smoke upward without letting wind backdraft down into her chambers. She'd built the fireplace using techniques she'd watched stonemasons use, layering clay and stone, creating a perfect curve to the interior that maintained draft. The hearth itself could hold enough coals to provide warmth throughout a night, allowing her to wake to embers still glowing red, ready to resurrect into flame with the addition of dry wood. She'd made a door for the main entrance, heavy wood on iron hinges, carved from a single oak plank, with a lock that required a key only she possessed. The door was weathered smooth by 15 years of handling, its wood darkened to near black. She'd sealed the secondary entrances she'd found, the ones that opened on the downslope side, by carefully stacking stone in a pattern that would survive pressure and weather, but could, if necessary, be reopened from the inside. One of these sealed entrances was actually close to the main spring chamber, and if someday that became necessary, she knew exactly how to dismantle that seal from within. The community had begun to notice her gathering sometime around year 7 of her work. The men who still traded with her, the ones who needed her skill with the knife, who sometimes came to her to have wounds dressed because she didn't charge money and her hands were steady, had remarked on it. She was buying salt in quantities they'd never seen. She was trading honey-preserved fruit to the beekeeper, paying far too much. She'd somehow acquired 3 massive ceramic jars from a potter 2 valleys over. She was out in all weather, smoking meat, drying things, moving through the forest gathering plants with the intensity of someone searching for something she couldn't quite find. People talked. They always do. Old Aunt Martha, who lived with her son's family at the northern end of the settlement, had suggested that Agnes was becoming unmoored, that her grief for Thomas was expressing itself in this strange, obsessive gathering. Surely, Martha had said, the poor woman was trying to fill some emptiness that could never be filled with jars and dried meat. The community doctor, a man named Matthias Webb, who'd come to the mountains from the Piedmont and never left, had observed that such gathering behavior, when it began in older women, sometimes indicated the early signs of dementia. Not that anyone would say it to Agnes's face. She was too formidable for that, too much of a woman who seemed to exist in a category where normal social rules didn't quite apply. But they noticed. And into that noticing stepped Judge Harlan Cobb. Judge Cobb had arrived in the settlement in 1880, nearly 3 years before this winter that would change everything, though nobody knew that yet. He was a man from the Piedmont, from the flatlands, and the new money that was beginning to flow through Carolina and Tennessee. The kind of man who saw mountains as nothing but obstacles and opportunity. He was in his early 50s, with the soft, fleshy face of someone who'd spent his life in offices and drawing rooms, a ruddy complexion that came from good whiskey and bad decisions, dark eyes that calculated the value of everything they rested on. He dressed as if he were still in Charlotte, in wool frock coats and cream-colored waistcoats with pearl buttons, cavalry boots polished to a shine that seemed obscene in a place where the earth itself was unwashed. He carried a gold watch chain across his middle and spoke in the practiced, serpentine manner of a man used to having his words believed. He'd come because the railroad companies were expanding, and the rail lines that would eventually connect the Piedmont to the flatlands of the Midwest would need to pass through Appalachia. That much was certain. The geography made it inevitable. What wasn't certain was exactly where those lines would go, which valleys would be torn open by tracks, which settlements would become boom towns, and which would be forgotten. Judge Cobb was positioning himself to ensure that he profited from that uncertainty. He'd begun buying property, small tracts from settlers who were just scraping by, who could be convinced to sell for cash they immediately spent on whiskey or flour. He was friendly with the county officials, the ones who could issue permits and define boundaries and change the nature of property rights with a pen stroke. He had his eye on the hollow where Agnes Whitmore lived. It was prime land, high enough to avoid the worst floods, with a stream that ran year-round, with stone underneath that could be quarried for railroad beds. The problem was that Agnes owned it outright. Thomas had bought it when land was cheap, had paid cash from the money his father left him, and the deed was recorded and absolute. Judge Cobb had tried the civilized approach first. He'd come to her house on an autumn afternoon in 1880, brought a bottle of rye whiskey as a gift, and proposed a sale. His terms were generous by settlement standards, $40 an acre, when the land itself was worth maybe $8, when the improvements were negligible. Agnes had listened to him speak for perhaps 2 minutes, then had stood, walked to her door, opened it, and said, "No." That was all, one word. No elaboration, no discussion, no feminine apology for being difficult. Just no. Judge Cobb had left, and if his pride was wounded, he'd hidden it well. But he'd begun, after that, to watch her more carefully. He'd remarked on her gathering behavior when he spoke to the doctor. He'd suggested quietly to some of the prominent men in the settlement that old women living alone often lost their grip on reason. He'd been perfectly civil about it, had framed it as concern, as a worry that Agnes might hurt herself or spiral into circumstances that would require intervention. He'd planted seeds. And then, in late September 1883, just a few weeks before the winter that nobody was predicting, the winter that would change everything, he'd made his move. He'd gotten together with the county clerk, a man named Harrison Featherstone, who owed him money from a card game, and they'd filed a petition for a competency hearing. The petition alleged that Agnes Whitmore was unfit to manage her property that her gathering behavior indicated obsession and irrationality, that she was a danger to herself, and that her land should be placed under a trustee, someone responsible and with clear thinking, someone who could manage it properly and perhaps arrange for Agnes's comfort in her declining years. The petition was legal, technically speaking. It was also vicious. The hearing was scheduled for late November, after the first snows had come, but before the valley would be fully cut off. The message was clear. Judge Cobb wanted her land, wanted her declared incompetent before the season shifted, wanted to have control of her property wrapped up and legal before anyone could challenge it. Agnes received the notice of the hearing from the county clerk's son, a boy of about 16 who was embarrassed to deliver it. She read it once, carefully, sitting in her rocking chair on her small porch, her calloused hands holding the folded paper. Then she folded it again and burned it in her cooking fire. The boy was still standing there, waiting for a response, some indication of upset or fear, or the appropriate kind of feminine distress. Agnes looked at him and said, "Tell them I won't be attending." And that was that. She didn't spend any energy on anger or fear, or the kind of self-doubt that Judge Cobb probably expected would paralyze her. Instead, she doubled down on her work. She walked into the mountains and found mushroom patches that had been growing there since before the settlement existed, and she dried them all. She killed her annual deer and killed a second one besides and smoked every ounce of meat. She visited the beekeeper and made arrangements to trade for every drop of honey he had left before winter. She gathered walnuts and hickory nuts from the forest floor, cracked them herself, stored the meats in jars sealed with lard. She found wild grapes growing on the south face of the hill and dried them into something almost like raisins. She made soap, pounds and pounds of it, rendered from lard and wood ash, pale and hard and practical. She made candles from the fat of the deer, dipped them herself, stored them in tightly bound bundles, 43 bundles of 7 candles each. That was what she made that autumn. She was not afraid. Fear was something for people who didn't know how to survive. Agnes knew, and somewhere in early October, as the leaves began their turn, a girl had come to her. The girl's name was Willa, and she was perhaps 14 or 15, daughter of a farmer named Samuel Pruitt, who had too many children and not enough land, and constantly expressed the feeling that he had 3 too many mouths to feed. Willa was awed by the standards of the settlement, too smart for her own good, too interested in things that girls weren't supposed to care about, too quick to question her mother's stories about what women were or should be. She'd heard stories about the old woman in the hollow, the one people said was crazy, the one who killed her own meat and lived like the mountains hadn't been civilized yet. Willa had come to her house on a gray afternoon and had asked, simply and directly, "Will you teach me?" Agnes had looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the quick mind in the girl's eyes, the calluses on her hands from trying to help with work that was too heavy for her, the mixture of fear and determination on her face, and had said, "What do you want to learn?" "Everything," Willa said. So Agnes had taught her. She'd shown her how to salt meat so it would last, how to know which mushrooms would poison you and which would cure you, how to render lard so it didn't spoil, how to pack fruit in jars with syrup and seal them so the air couldn't get in, how to dry herbs so they kept their potency, how to think about the future, not the distant, abstract future, but the concrete future of 6 months or 8 months, when the snow would be deep and you'd need to have everything already done. Willa had been a fast learner. She'd come every few days, and Agnes had let her work alongside her, had shown her how to judge the temperature of oil for rendering, how to pack a jar so the contents wouldn't shift or break, how to predict which season would bring which materials. They'd become something like friends, in the way that people who work together toward a shared goal often do. Not sentimental, not particularly warm, but bound by mutual respect and the simple fact of doing hard things together. And then, in the last week before the hearing that Agnes had refused to attend, the snow had come. It had come early, earlier than anyone expected, a blizzard that moved in from the north and west with the kind of force that made it clear this wasn't going to be a normal winter. The hearing was canceled. The roads became impassable within hours, and there was no way the county clerk or Judge Cobb or any of the witnesses could have made it through. The settlement hunkered down, expecting the snow to pass, expecting the winter to be difficult but manageable. People had survived Appalachian winters for centuries. This was nothing new. But by the second week of November, by mid-month, it became clear that this wasn't a normal winter at all. The snow came in waves, day after day, accumulation upon accumulation. Temperatures dropped and stayed dropped. 0 degrees Fahrenheit on the nights when the wind was worst, the kind of cold that hurt to breathe, that could kill a person who was caught in it for more than an hour. The supply routes that connected the settlement to the larger towns, to the places where you could buy flour and coffee and salt, all of them became impassable. The trails were buried, the roads were drifted over. There were no travelers coming in. There were no supplies coming in. By the time December arrived, the settlement had begun to understand that they were trapped, not trapped in the way that felt dramatic or exciting, but trapped in a completely practical, terrifying sense. People had stores, of course. Every household had preserved food, had salt pork, had root cellars with turnips and potatoes and winter squash. But most families had provision for maybe 3 months of scarcity, maybe 4 at most if they rationed carefully. They hadn't provisioned for 6 months. They hadn't provisioned for a winter that wouldn't break, that seemed to exist in some place outside of the normal seasonal rotation. The snow kept coming. By the end of December, the drifts were taller than most men. The temperature never climbed above freezing, not even on the occasional bright days when the sun came out and seemed to mock them with its false promise of warmth. Inside the houses, the fires burned constantly, consuming wood at rates that alarmed every family. The woodpiles that had seemed adequate in October were visibly shrinking. Some families, the ones with older houses and thinner walls, were going through wood at twice the anticipated rate. By January, when the cold showed no sign of abating and the snow in the valley was 18 feet deep in places, when it had drifted against houses and barns and made everything feel like living in a cave made of frozen water, people began to understand that they'd made a terrible mistake. The livestock started dying. First, the weakest animals, the old cattle and pigs that hadn't been healthy to begin with. Then the younger stock began to fail because they couldn't be kept warm. That couldn't be adequately fed because the fodder everyone had put up was running short. By mid-January, families were killing their remaining animals, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't afford to feed them. A cow that wouldn't eat anymore, that was wasting away on depleted hay stores, had to be slaughtered so at least the meat could be used. The settlement's butcher, a man named Peter Oakes, was working constantly, processing livestock from families who were trying to salvage what they could. The meat needed to be smoked or salted immediately, and the process of preservation was exhausting him. Venison was becoming harder to find. The hunters who went into the mountains in this kind of weather were risking their lives, and the returns were small and getting smaller. The game had retreated to places where they couldn't be easily found. Men would return from hunting expeditions, frostbitten and exhausted, having walked all day in deep snow and found nothing. The forest itself seemed to have turned hostile, keeping its creatures hidden. The root cellars, opened regularly to pull out turnips and potatoes and preserved vegetables, were emptying faster than anyone had anticipated. What had seemed like an adequate store in September looked tragically inadequate by January. The turnips would run out. The potatoes would run out. The squash would begin to rot if they weren't used. Families faced the terrible mathematics of scarcity. How do you ration something that runs out in February when winter lasts until April? By mid-January, families were rationing. By the end of January, they were severely rationing, cutting portions by more than half. Rationing had begun, not the formal kind announced to the settlement, but the practical kind that happened in family groups, where the adults gradually ate less so that the children could eat more. A household that had expected to eat 3 meals a day was soon eating 2, then 1 substantial meal and perhaps some broth at midday. Some families stopped eating breakfast altogether, just a cup of weak tea to warm the belly before the endless hours of trying to stay warm through another day. By February, people were hungry. Not the kind of hunger that makes you want a better meal. The kind of hunger that haunts you. The kind of hungry that was never quite satisfied, where a belly full of watered potato soup felt like victory, where a piece of bread with lard was a luxury meal. The kind of hungry that made you tired, that made your mind slow, that made you understand that hunger was something your body experienced every hour of every day. Children became listless. They would sit by the fire for hours without moving, conserving energy. The pregnant women in the settlement were suffering, and everyone knew it, though nobody spoke about it. Mothers were giving more of their rations to their children. Fathers were going without to provide for their families. The impact on everyone's strength, everyone's resilience, was becoming visibly obvious. By February, there were illnesses. A cold that would normally have been minor became something terrifying when your body was weak from hunger and cold. 3 children came down with influenza. One of them, a boy named Thomas, after all the Thomases in the mountains, died. He was 4 years old. His funeral was quiet, conducted in bitter cold, the ground too frozen to dig a deep grave. People stood in the snow in their inadequate clothes and watched a small body lowered into the earth, and nobody had to say what they all understood, that the hunger and cold had claimed him, and there would be more. By March, people were starting to look gaunt. Cheekbones emerged from faces that had been rounded. Eyes seemed larger in heads that had become too thin. Skin that had been taut became loose, hanging slightly as bodies burned their own reserves for fuel. The light that had characterized the living seemed to dim slightly in the eyes of those who were starving. The schoolteacher's wife delivered a baby, and everyone could see the child was too small, that the mother had given too much of herself to protect the fetus that was growing inside her. The baby weighed what a baby should weigh at 5 months, not full term. The schoolteacher stood over his wife and child with a look of desperate helplessness on his face, knowing that the child's smallness was a direct result of his wife's sacrifice and unable to do anything about it. The baby lived, but barely, and its first weeks were terrifying watches in the dark, where the parents waited to see if the child would survive or if their sacrifice would be meaningless. An old man named George Calder died in his sleep in the middle of March. Just stopped breathing. Nobody could say exactly why. but everyone understood it was hunger. He'd given most of his rations to his grandchildren. His daughter had wept quietly at his funeral. Not just grief, but guilt, because she knew that her father had starved himself so that her own children could eat. Guilt, because in the world as it had been, there would have been enough for everyone. Guilt, because her father had made a choice that nobody should have had to make. Guilt, because she was alive and her father was not, and that had been arranged by his own hand, his own choice to eat less so that she and her grandchildren could eat more. It was in this context, in the grinding, endless, terrible context of a settlement eating itself alive slowly, carefully, watching itself starve because that was what happened when you didn't prepare, that Samuel Pruitt finally came to Agnes. He came in early April, when the snow had finally begun to thin on the south-facing slopes, when the creek was starting to run fuller, when anyone with eyes could see that the winter was finally breaking. He came to her door with his youngest child in his arms, a boy about 5 years old who was so thin you could count his ribs through his shirt. Behind him came his wife, Margaret, with 2 more children, and Willa, young Willa with her quick eyes, looking at Agnes with something between desperation and vindication. Samuel was a good man. He'd always been a good man. He'd worked hard, had managed his farm with intelligence, had kept his family as fed and warm as the settlement's circumstances allowed. He was also a practical man. When the hunger had begun in earnest, he'd heard the stories, everyone had, about the old woman in the hollow, the crazy one, the one who'd been gathering things in a way that made no sense. There had been some speculation about whether she might have food, but it was quiet speculation. Nobody had said it aloud. Nobody had wanted to acknowledge that Agnes Whitmore, the woman Judge Cobb had tried to have declared incompetent just months ago, might actually be the only person who'd prepared adequately. And pride was a strong thing. Asking for help, admitting that you hadn't planned well, that the woman everyone had dismissed was the one person who had genuinely understood what was coming. That was hard. It had taken the sight of his youngest child's ribs, had taken 3 months of watching his wife grow weaker, had taken the death of George Calder and the death of young Thomas, and the knowledge that if nothing changed, more people would follow them. It had taken the understanding that his own children might die before spring truly came. It had taken all of that to overcome the pride, to gather his family, to walk through the late winter snow to the hollow where Agnes lived. She saw him coming from a distance. She'd been doing morning work, checking her snares and her small storage area outside the cave mouth, when she spotted movement on the trail. She watched the figures making their slow way through the snow. She could see from their movements, from the way they carried themselves, that they were hungry. Hunger has a gait. It's slower, more careful, more conserving of energy. She recognized him as he got closer. She knew everyone in the settlement by sight, could read them the way other people read words on a page. She saw the thinness of his family. She saw the way his youngest son hung in his arms like a sack of grain, not moving, not playing, just existing in that exhausted state of childhood starvation. She saw the desperation in his face, the face of a man who had tried everything else and was now coming to ask for help from the woman his settlement had dismissed as crazy. And she did something remarkable. She smiled, just a little smile, just the faintest change in the weathered landscape of her face, not triumphant or cruel, but something closer to recognition. A smile that said, "I see you, I understand, I've been waiting for you." Willa saw it, and it would stay with her for the rest of her life. "Come inside," Agnes said, and she opened the heavy wooden door to the cave. The family entered, and what they saw inside that limestone chamber must have felt like entering another world. The light from Agnes's candles, those hundreds of candles she'd made from deer fat, hung in the darkness like small stars. The shelves rose up around them, row after row, filled with jars. The smell was overwhelming. Smoke and salt and herbs. The smell of things preserved. The smell of preparation and plan, and the fundamental human act of storing food against hunger. There were hams hanging from the ceiling. There were crocks of lard, dozens of them. There were baskets of nuts, bundles of dried herbs, woven containers holding dried mushrooms and fruit. The stone fireplace was burning, warm and steady, and the temperature inside the cave was so much warmer than outside that all of them gasped. Physical warmth, actual warmth, something they'd barely known for months. Margaret Pruitt began to cry. Samuel stood motionless, taking it in, trying to understand what he was seeing. And Willa walked toward the shelves with something like awe on her face, touching the glass of the jars, reading the labels Agnes had written, understanding finally the full scope of what the old woman had built. "How many people?" Agnes asked Samuel. It was the first real question she'd asked him, the only one that mattered. "Our family is 5, he said. "But if the others knew—" He trailed off. He didn't need to finish. Agnes nodded slowly. "I can feed 30 for 4 months, she said. "Maybe a bit longer if I stretch it. It'll be tight, but it's possible." She looked at Willa. "You know how to ration. You know what goes where. You'll help me manage it." Willa nodded, not trusting her voice. And then Agnes did something else remarkable. She said to Samuel, "Go back to the settlement. Tell them everyone. Tell them to come here, to my cave, and they'll be fed. Tell them we'll establish a system. Tell them that eating together is better than starving alone." What followed was something between an exodus and a pilgrimage. Word spread through the settlement like fire through dry kindling, though whether that was good or a bad thing, nobody quite knew. The community came, in groups and families, moving through the late winter snow to the hollow, to the cave system that Agnes Whitmore had been building for 15 years in the face of everyone's dismissal and doubt. They came expecting to beg. Instead, Agnes gave orders. She organized them with the practical precision of someone who'd been thinking about this moment for a long time. The main chamber of the cave became a food distribution center. The smaller chambers became sleeping spaces. There was room for people to crowd together for warmth, dry stone to sleep on, blankets that could be shared. The kitchen chamber, the one where Agnes had been doing her cooking and food preparation, became the center of meal creation. She appointed Willa as her primary assistant and put Samuel in charge of rationing, of calculating portions, of making sure everything was distributed fairly. Margaret Pruitt became her second assistant, learning alongside Willa how to make meals that stretched precious resources, how to make a broth from bones that had already given their meat, how to add the preserved vegetables in a way that made the supplies last. Every morning there was a meal, porridge made from the grain she'd stored, thickened with rendered fat, flavored with herbs that made it almost taste like there was more substance to it than there actually was. Agnes had learned to cook in the cave, to manage fires that didn't use up precious wood at an unsustainable rate, to stretch every calorie, every nutrient to its absolute maximum. She could make a meal from what seemed like nothing, a handful of grain, a spoonful of fat, some dried vegetables, a few leaves of herb, and water from the spring, and have it emerge tasting not just adequate, but genuinely nourishing. She understood the chemistry of cooking in ways she couldn't have articulated, but which showed in every meal. At midday, broth. Bones from the smoked meat she'd preserved, boiled with vegetables, with grains, with anything that could add nutrition and flavor. She'd make stock by boiling bones for hours, extracting every molecule of nutrient, every bit of taste. The broth would be clear but deeply flavorful, enriched with dissolved minerals and fats. She'd add dried vegetables, the tomatoes she'd preserved, the beans, the corn, and they would rehydrate and soften, adding substance and flavor and color to what might otherwise have seemed like dirty water. She'd add grains, barley, rye, oats. She'd add herbs, sage for strength, thyme for flavor, feverfew for the children's fevers. In the evening, another helping of something substantial, maybe flatbread made with lard and flour, maybe beans with salt pork, maybe a thin stew that everyone understood was made with absolute care from extremely limited resources. She would cook the beans with herbs and fat, and they would become creamy and rich tasting, despite being stretched thin to feed dozens. She would make flatbread on hot stones at the edge of the fire, each piece a fraction of what she'd normally make, but satisfying because it was warm and tasted like something real. No one went hungry. That was the miracle of it. In a settlement where people were dying, where children were growing listless, where the carefully hoarded stores of autumn had proven fundamentally inadequate, Agnes's cave became a place of life. People went from hunger to adequacy, from adequacy to something approaching satisfaction. The transformation happened gradually over weeks as bodies began to recover from the worst deprivation. Children who had been listless began to play again, though they were still thin. Women who had been gray with exhaustion regained a little color in their cheeks. Men who had been hollow-eyed began to think about things besides the immediate need to survive the next hour. The supplies did last. They lasted through April, through May, through June, through July, and into August. The portions were smaller than people would have wanted. Nobody was eating with the kind of abundance that was normal in better times. But nobody starved. Nobody died. Nobody had to watch their children's cheekbones emerge through skin the way they had been in February and March. The settlement ate together in Agnes's cave, on her food, sharing meals that were the direct result of her 15 years of preparation. And slowly, over those months, something shifted in the way people understood Agnes Whitmore. The woman they dismissed as eccentric, the one Judge Cobb had tried to have declared incompetent, was revealed to be someone fundamentally different, someone who had seen clearly what others couldn't see, who had prepared when others refused to prepare, who had the knowledge and the strength and the practical wisdom to keep people alive. The reversal was complete. By the time the winter finally truly broke, by the time supplies began to arrive again from the outside, by the time the settlement could function independently once more, Agnes had been transformed from a cautionary tale about old women living alone to something approaching a folk hero. She'd done the work without complaint. She'd organized the community without being asked. She'd taught everyone what she knew without holding anything back. When Judge Cobb arrived at the cave in late April, when the roads had finally cleared enough for him to travel, when hunger had worn the polish off his frock coat and made his face more skull-like than ruddy, he came not as an authority figure, but as a supplicant. Agnes fed him anyway. She gave him the same portions as everyone else, made sure he had a place to sleep, let him eat her preserved food without comment or recrimination. But the community saw him. They saw what he'd tried to do, saw his humiliation, saw the fundamental weakness in a man who'd been soft enough to almost starve. And when the summer came, when the competency hearing was rescheduled for August, the community came. They came to the courthouse. Not all of them, because someone had to stay on the farms and tend the planting, but enough of them. They came in a group, dressed in their Sunday clothes, carrying themselves with the quiet dignity of people who had survived something that had tried to kill them. Samuel Pruitt testified about the cave, about the organization, about the brilliance of Agnes's preparation. He described, in careful detail, exactly what he had seen when he first opened that door: the shelves, the jars, the organization, the planning. He talked about how Agnes had calculated portions with mathematical precision, how she'd managed a community of 30 people for 4 months on supplies that would have seemed impossible to most people. He talked about his children living, about his wife surviving when she might have died. He talked about Agnes with a kind of reverence that made it clear this wasn't just gratitude, but recognition of something extraordinary. The teacher testified about her knowledge of preservation. She spoke about the science of it, about how Agnes understood drying and smoking and canning in ways that suggested she'd either been taught by someone expert or had figured it out through years of careful experimentation. She talked about how Agnes had been willing to share that knowledge with young Willa, how she'd approached the problem of survival with the kind of systematic thinking that you'd expect from an educated man, not an eccentric old woman living alone. A doctor, not Matthias Webb, who suddenly found he had other business to attend to, testified about her physical and mental fitness. He examined Agnes on the stand and described her as the most physically fit and mentally sharp woman of her age that he'd encountered. He noted the calloused hands, the clear eyes, the steady mind. He noted that she'd managed to plan and execute one of the most complex logistical operations he'd ever seen, and that such an accomplishment would be remarkable from any person, but was almost miraculous from someone of her age and circumstances. And Willa testified, her young voice clear and steady, about the time she'd spent learning from Agnes, about the scientific precision with which the old woman approached the problem of survival. She talked about the inventory system Agnes had created, about the careful labeling of supplies, about the detailed knowledge of which plants needed which preservation techniques. She described watching Agnes work, watching an old woman approach survival not as a desperate scramble, but as a carefully thought-out problem that could be solved through intelligence, observation, and work. The judge, not Cobb, who'd withdrawn from the proceedings in humiliation, but an older man from the county seat who actually understood the law, listened to all of it and ruled immediately. He spoke for nearly an hour, laying out his reasoning, describing in detail why the original petition had been not just mistaken, but actively vicious. He noted that what looked to untrained observers like obsession was actually preparation. What looked like eccentricity was actually intelligence. What looked like a woman losing her mind was actually a woman seeing clearly what others couldn't see. He declared, his voice carrying through the courtroom, that there was no incompetency. There was no guardianship. Agnes Whitmore was ruled to be of sound mind and body, to have absolute dominion over her property, and her property rights were protected permanently against any future challenge. He ordered, furthermore, that all future attempts to challenge her competency or her property rights be barred unless new evidence of genuine incapacity could be presented. In the context of the law, it was the strongest possible protection. Judge Cobb left the settlement within a week. He didn't get the land. He didn't get anything. He went back to the Piedmont, to the places where his soft hands and his whiskey habit and his calculated cruelty might still be useful. And Agnes went back to her cave. The settlement had learned to preserve food, had learned to plan, had learned the value of preparation, but they were ultimately still people who lived in the normal patterns of settlement life, who would gradually revert to the rhythm of immediate needs and distant possibilities. Agnes was different. She wasn't done preparing. The supplies needed to be replenished. The jars needed to be cleaned and refilled. The system she'd built needed to be maintained. She opened her doors to Willa still, let her come and learn, not just during the crisis, but during the normal times as well, teaching her not just the skills of survival, but the mindset, the clear-eyed understanding that the mountains were beautiful and terrible, and that they demanded respect, that they demanded preparation, that they didn't care about the softness of city clothes or the pride of men who'd never learned to listen to what the earth was trying to tell them. The winter of 1883 to 1884, the winter that had nearly starved the settlement, that had revealed the true value of preparation, that had transformed Agnes Whitmore from a cautionary tale into a legend. That winter became the story that defined the community. People told it to their children, and their children told it to theirs. They told it the way all foundational stories are told, the way stories that explain something fundamental about how the world works get passed down. They told it as a reminder that the mountains remember those who prepare, and they punish those who don't. Agnes Whitmore lived another 18 years. She never left the hollow. She never married again. She didn't need to, didn't want to, didn't have any reason to change a life that had proven itself to be exactly what needed to be lived. She kept the cave stocked. She kept teaching. She kept gathering and preserving and storing and planning. Every autumn, the cycle repeated. The animals she needed to harvest, the plants she needed to dry, the vegetables she needed to preserve. Every winter, the community knew where to find food if disaster struck again. The settlement evolved, but Agnes remained constant. She became something like an institution, a living embodiment of the principle that preparation was possible, that seeing clearly was more valuable than fitting in. She accepted that as her role and moved through her final decades with the same steady focus she'd always possessed. Willa grew up, became a woman, eventually took over much of the work when Agnes's hands became too stiff, too painful for the finest work. Though even in her 70s, Agnes could still dress a deer, could still manage the heavy work that demanded strength and will. Willa had absorbed everything Agnes had to teach her, not just the techniques, but the philosophy, the way of moving through the world with intention and awareness. By the time Agnes was in her 80s, Willa was taking primary responsibility for the cave system's maintenance. Though Agnes still oversaw everything, still made the final decisions, still understood the system better than anyone ever would. When Agnes died, quietly, in her sleep, in the sleeping platform she'd built in that side chamber of her cave, the community mourned her like they'd mourn a founder, like they'd mourn someone who had literally saved their lives. People came from settlements all through the mountains to pay their respects. They came not just from her own valley, but from places days' walk away. They came because word had spread, because the story of the old woman had become something more than a story. It had become a truth that everyone understood, a principle that every family taught their children. And the cave system, the one she'd built over 15 years and maintained for 18 more, became a place of pilgrimage. People came to see it, to understand it, to teach their children what preparation looked like, what the difference was between someone who saw clearly and someone who was blind. Families would walk there in the autumn and stand in that main chamber and feel the cool air and see the shelves and understand in a concrete way what preparation meant. The jars sat on their shelves, most of them empty by then, their glass catching candlelight. Willa continued the work, continued to fill those jars and maintain that system. The stone shelves themselves became a kind of monument, a physical manifestation of what one woman could accomplish when she stopped caring what people thought and started caring, instead, about what was true. Visitors would run their hands along those shelves, feeling the smoothness worn by years of Agnes's careful work, understanding that these weren't built quickly or carelessly, but had been shaped by hands that knew exactly what they were doing, hands that had a vision and the patience to execute it. And in the settlement, in the generations that followed, the story lived on. If you ever asked someone from that area, someone whose ancestors had lived through that winter, they would tell you the story of the old woman in the hollow. They would tell you how she'd built a cave system with her own hands, how she'd predicted a winter nobody else saw coming, how she'd saved 36 people from starvation, how the man who tried to have her, declared incompetent, had ended up homeless and hungry at her door, and how she'd fed him anyway. They would tell you about her hands, those swollen-knuckled, calloused hands, and what those hands had accomplished. They would tell you about the cave, about the jars, about the organization and the knowledge. They would tell their children, and their children would tell theirs. The story would be told in farmhouse kitchens, around fires in the winter, at gatherings in the settlement. It would become part of the folklore of the mountains, part of what it meant to be from that place. They would tell you this story because it meant something. It meant that the world operated according to rules that had nothing to do with social position or smooth hands, or the ability to convince people in an office that you were trustworthy. It meant that survival went to the person who could see, who could prepare, who could do the work when nobody was watching. It meant that the mountains had their own logic, and that logic was stronger than any law. It meant that one person, acting with clear sight and steady hands, could save a community. That one person's vision, pursued despite ridicule and opposition, could prove more valuable than all the political maneuvering of those who dismissed her. That winter, the winter that nobody predicted, that nobody prepared for except one old woman who'd been called eccentric and worse. That winter was the thing that proved, finally and absolutely, that Agnes Whitmore had been right all along. She had seen what was coming when others were blind. She had prepared when others ignored the future. She had built something that outlasted her and continued to matter. And the cave, the limestone chambers in the mountain, with their constant cool temperature and their perfect shelves and their carefully preserved foods and their stone fireplace. That cave became a kind of temple to the truth that the mountains remember those who prepare, and they punish those who don't. It stood as proof. It stood as monument. It stood as a reminder that vision, work, and preparation matter. If you're watching this, if you've made it to the end of Agnes's story, I want you to think about what that means for your own life. What are you preparing for? What storms do you see coming that others don't? What resources are you gathering while the season is right? What knowledge are you building? What systems are you creating? What foresight are you practicing right now that might save your life or the lives of those around you when crisis comes? because crisis will come. The mountains remember, and so should we. Like and subscribe for more stories of preparation, vindication, and the quiet strength of those who see what's coming. Comment below and tell us which moment from Agnes's story stayed with you. The moment she sealed her cave door despite Judge Cobb's accusation. The moment Samuel Pruitt saw those shelves for the first time. The moment the judge ruled in her favor. Or was it the way she fed Judge Cobb when he came to her starving, showing mercy to the man who had tried to destroy her? Each moment in this story is part of something larger, the principle that the prepared survive, that those who see clearly shape the future, and that the mountains, in their ancient wisdom, remember everything.